Um, Welcome everyone to the second in our series of monthly webinars from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. They're called Inside the Investigation. My name is Ellen Weiss, and I'm a very proud and honored member of the FIJ board. Um, just a little bit of background. We started this series for a couple of reasons. One, we get to shine a light on some of the really terrific and impactful investigative work and hear from the reporters about how they did their groundbreaking investigations. We get to share some concrete tips and resources that we hope all of you and other journalists can use in your work. We get to feature investigations that were produced with the fund's support, and we're going to talk a little bit more at the very end about deadlines for applying for FIJ grants and how we can help you, in that application. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Rebecca and I are going to chat for, 20 or 30 minutes. If you have questions, just add them whenever they occur to you in the Q&A section. We're going to be recording this webinar and posting it with some of the resources on the FIJ website. So if you don't take notes, don't worry about it, you're safe. And because you've registered, you'll also get an email with all that, with the recording and all that information as well. Yeah, so with all of that, I want to welcome Rebecca Clarren. Here's what Rebecca knew about her immigrant family's origins. Her great-grandparents, the Sinikins, and their 6 children fled anti-Semitism in Russia and arrived in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And they ultimately settled on a 160-acre homestead in South Dakota. And over the next few decades, despite a lot of tough years in this sort of merciless area and lots of setbacks, the Sinikins actually became an American immigrant success story. But there's a lot missing from that story, and a lot missing from how their success affected some of the other people that were also living in South Dakota at the time. And Rebecca decided to investigate not just the systematic destruction of the indigenous communities and the culture and wealth, but also her family's own history and sort of the tug between their story of survival and resilience, but at the expense of others. Prior to writing her book, The Cost of Free Land, Rebecca has been reporting and writing about the West for decades, more than 20 years. She's won numerous awards for that reporting, and also for her book, The Cost of Free Land, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So, Rebecca, maybe you can start by introducing us to your family. Tell us a little bit more where they came from. I mean, there's so many great characters. I am going to share my screen, and maybe you can talk to us about some of who we're meeting.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ellen. It is such an honor to be here. I really credit the fund for, honestly, for the support needed for me to be a full-time freelancer for so many years for magazines. So it is really an honor to be here. Yes, let's talk about my family. So I think a lot about what are the stories that we tell in families and in nations, and what are the stories we don't tell, and why don't we tell certain stories? And so the stories that I knew before working on this book for a number of years were sort of like a classic immigrant script. Like, they worked hard and then they got ahead. And there's so much more meat to that story, of course, than the story that had been told. We don't throw anything away in my family. It's like a gene or something. I also have boxes in my attic I found like a school program from 3rd grade up there recently that I then write about in the book. But in my Aunt Edda's house, she's 91 now, in closets where other people keep like food or coats, she has boxes of letters and photographs. And so these photographs came in large part from my family archive. This is a photograph taken in the shtetl that my Jewish ancestors lived in before coming to America. This is called Kapulia. It's near what is today Minsk in Belarus. And you can see that there's Yiddish writing on the top of the picture. That says, I had it translated, it means the Hinterish house, the back house. And this is my great-grandmother who I'm named after. These are her older siblings. And we think this photograph was probably taken and sent to my great-great-grandfather, Harry Sinekin, when he was already in America to say, here, look what your children look like now. But I just love how you can see what they're wearing. Their life in Russia was very, very hard. Jews could not own land by law. They were not allowed to own land when my family was living there. And they were also constrained economically from a lot of different, like my great-great-grandfather was a smith, but Jews couldn't be part of the gold or silver smith, so he could only work with tin. There was a lot of fear that Jewish boys would be conscripted into the Russian army. The stories are that they would be sent to the front, made to convert to Christianity, and that they were sort of used as cannon fodder. And also there was pogroms, which were these like kind of vigilante justice events that were happening periodically, where soldiers or peasants would kill and rape Jews and break all of their homes and businesses. So life was very unstable for my family there. And when Harry, who's already in America, learns about this opportunity to get free land on the South Dakota prairie, he probably saw a sign something like this somewhere in a train station or in a newspaper. I mean, this sign is from the Library of Congress. It is not exactly what he would have seen because it obviously says Indian land for sale. But my family gets in on these free homesteads that are on offer in South Dakota. And that money, I think, based on the documents I found, the money that my great-great-grandfather gets as a mortgage on the value of that free land is what he uses to bring the last members of my family over from Russia to America, my great-great-grandmother and her three youngest children, including my great-grandmother. And they come to America and they take the rail line all the way to Sioux City, Iowa, where there are so many Jews already living in Sioux City. There's a synagogue called the Anshe Kapulia that's named for the shtetl of Kapulia, where they came from. And there's about 70 Jews in all that leave Sioux City in 1906-ish, 1908-ish, and they set up on the South Dakota prairie. I say ish because I got the original homesteading records. And for those of you who are interested in using data to do your research, the National Archives, for the big cost of $25, I think, but also you have to wait many, many, many months, will send you the original homesteading documents of any homestead. And they're amazing because they don't just tell you where the land was. It tells you my great-great-grandparents had to fill out these paperwork that showed like when they built their house, what were the crops they built, how did it go? And I learned from those that it went very poorly. They lost all of their first crops 3 years running, which is why they quickly decide they should be ranchers and not farmers. But if you want to show, the next couple slides are just some photos of what their life was like on the prairie. The man with those amazing boots, second from the right, is my great-grandfather, Jake Cosberg. All three Sinekin daughters end up marrying Jew Flats homesteaders. They're all Jewish men speaking with the same accents, speaking Yiddish. This is the kind of house that most homesteaders in South Dakota would build. They were about 10 by 12. I learned that from looking through all these old sort of first accounts by the children and actual homesteaders themselves that were put together in the 50s by county, really. People described that these houses were all this size because this was the amount of wood you could get in one wagon load that you would bring with you. And this is my great-great-grandmother, Fega Etka. The stories that we love to tell about Fega Etka is that in the winter in South Dakota, she would dunk herself naked in the freezing water of the creek that ran behind her house. She would actually ask her daughters to crack the ice for her before she would dunk. That was her mikvah, which is a ritual bath that Jewish women take to mark the end of their menstrual cycles. But you can see my Aunt Fanny in this photo. In the far back, you can see sort of a sod structure. That was with, we think, probably the sod house they initially lived in before they could build their claim shack. It was a house made of sod bricks.
Wow.
And I grew up with, so where my family's land was, what locals still to this day call Jew Flats, even though no Jews have lived there for a very long time, was only 13 miles from the nearest Lakota reservation, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe Reservation. And their land that they were given had, until very recently, before they received it from the federal government, been Lakota land, land that had
So
been
let
promised.
me
Sorry.
stop you there for a minute because I want to ask a little bit about that
Yeah.
because the story you grow up with, right,
Yeah.
is this like this miracle, right? I
Yeah.
mean, your family fled persecution. It must seem like a gift. The Homestead Act is giving people 160 acres if you're willing to build a home and till the land. They're fleeing a place where they're forbidden, from owning their own land. They see these posters, they get there, there's a whole Jewish community, and I guess my question to you is like, when did you start questioning
Oh.
that narrative? Like, was there something that at some point in your life where you're like, huh, is there more to this story? I mean, you obviously are somebody who, you were steeped in, reporting about the West. You've obviously covered a lot of issues, but what was there something that happened? Was there that triggered you to say, wait a second, maybe I should ask this other question?
Well, honestly, I feel like it took me an embarrassingly long time to ask those questions because I didn't see it for a long time, but I was hired by an investigative nonprofit called Investigate West. I live in Oregon, and it covers Oregon and Washington, to write a series of stories about Native nations. And it was while I was, and those series ran in The Nation and Indian Country Today. And while I was doing that series, I just really had this slow dawning realization that while I was writing the series that was showing the legacy of historic federal policies of dispossessing native land and showing how those policies were playing out today, I suddenly finally found myself in this history of realizing, oh wait, but because my family were homesteaders, because my family got the land that was taken and dispossessed from native people, I'm part of this history. I've benefited here where others were harmed. So it was really when I was doing that series, and that was kind of 2017-ish, 2018, I was doing that work. And that's what led to this book. And also, it wasn't just that I had that realization, it was that we did that series. We tried to do it with a lot of thoughtfulness, and we had a advisory board of Native journalists and Native academics and scholars that helped us to make sure we were being thoughtful about the pieces. And I was able to sort of talk to then trusted sources and friends ultimately to say, can I do this? Should I do this? And heard from enough of them that said, you should do this. Like you finding yourself here is an important narrative to share. So
Interesting. Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the reporting of this story. I mean, again, given your experience, um, and the book covers a lot. I mean, because you can't tell your family story without telling a lot of the story of what the US government did to indigenous communities, right? Through wars, through laws, through, all sorts of things. How much of that history did you know? Like of the way that the US government treated tribal communities? How much did you know beforehand? And how much of it was actually still new to you?
I thought I knew a lot, and I realized in the 5 years it took me from beginning to end to work on this book that I didn't really know it at all. There's a line in the book where I say, I know I sound like a broken record, but frankly, the record is broken. And I really felt like that, like, oh my God, it's just the same over. The history I tell is really from about like 1850-ish to 1970. In 1970 is when my grandmother and her sisters sell the last bit of Jew Flats. And so it's this sort of period of time of when my family was in Russia, coming from Russia and owning the land. And yeah, I just didn't realize how intensely repetitive the American system of taking native land was, and really the the deep the deep depth of racism that directed those actions, and the deep there's so much of this book was also motivated in that way that I feel like is a very exciting aspect of being a journalist, of realizing that I've been thinking the wrong way for so long, of seeing the myths of America that I had been taught and starting to see them far more clearly for what they were, as hollow stories. So yeah. But you asked me what was the other part of that question you asked? How did I start to do the work to figure it out?
Well, again, part of it is, now we can go a little bit more deeply into like the actual piecing it together. You said that you were blessed by a family that were savers, which is really amazing. You have those pictures. What else, did your family keep as presumably dusted off a couple of boxes that, someone had passed down from hand to hand? But what else did you discover? And did you know that these things existed? Were they also sort of part of the family lore? Or was it just like, oh, I have this picture and this is the story that my family told about this picture, but now I'm like, there's a whole narrative also that unfolded inside those boxes.
So in my Aunt Etta's house, which you could call a museum, I mean, honestly, it's like our family museum. There is behind like a glass what she always called her Indian doll, which is this beaded Lakota, now I know, style of doll that was given to her when she was 3 years old by her Uncle Louis, who was a Jewish Flats homesteader. And her mother's riding gloves. My great grandmother was this wonderful horsewoman, and her riding gloves were beaded in this Lakota style. And she had a purse from, like, now I've seen photographs to mark, it was like 1914. She had this beaded Lakota style beaded purse, or maybe Dakota. So these things were there, like they were just part of the home I would visit in Minnesota whenever I visited my aunt and my grandmother. One weekend, I went to Minneapolis and I scanned with my phone. I put turbo scan on my phone and I scanned 1,000 pages of documents from my Aunt Etta's house in just 3 days. There were letters written in Yiddish that had been kept. There were so many letters, so many photographs. They took so many pictures. Like, and in the early 1900s, they were taking pictures. I had tax returns from 1911. I had documents that had been sent to me sent to my great grandmother from the Department of the Interior, which ended up being very useful to me, because I should say this was never meant to be sort of a definitive history of either the Lakota or a definitive history of Jewish immigrants. I was very interested in sort of like, where do these histories push and pull on one another? If we take them out of their silos in the ways they're usually taught, do we learn something new? And I think you do learn something new, because you see sort of the depth of injustice, frankly, of the way that certain people were picked, people like my ancestors, to benefit from policies that were very clearly meant to harm others.
Yeah, and you started to describe a little bit about, you have these personal stories, and we all, at some point, a lot of us in our reporting, we have somebody's personal story, right? But then we have to go and wrap those stories in facts, and documents, and figure out, well, where do those personal stories match up, and where do they divert? And, you actually had to investigate the recollections, right? Of what your family actually was doing, what was happening. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this. It also happened that I believe you did a lot of this reporting during COVID. And again, just kind of um, how much of this was literally about, pulling records hand by hand, how much of it was available online? And just curious about, if you have personal documents, like what tips do you have? What did you learn along the way about how you go about verifying those documents?
So yes, so many good questions. So first, I interviewed every single person in my family and my mom's generation and older who descended from those 6 Sinneken kids who were all homesteaders. And none of the original homesteaders are alive, but some of their children and many of their grandchildren. So I was interested in like, what are the stories that are told exactly the same way in every family? And what are the stories that are told differently? I started to get very curious about not just how the story is told, but what's the white space at the edges of the telling, and then getting curious about why. And as you said, I had so much of this sort of family lore, but from my training as an investigative reporter, I was sort of much more curious about how do you drape these stories on something resembling a fact? So it occurred to me at some point in my reporting, this wasn't at the very beginning, at the onset, that I could pull every single deed on my family's land, on the land they owned in South Dakota. And then I could pull every single mortgage on those deeds. And that would be a way to not only really understand the way the land was changing hands and growing, because by the 50s, my family had a 6,000-acre cattle ranch. My great grandmother had, mostly it was my great grandmother, had bought up all the parcels of Jew Flats and as well as others. And also, but to me, even though this isn't the huge piece of the writing of the book, to me, what is very much the backbone of this narrative at this point is that I could start to see the way the mortgages, when you paired them with the original documents I had, the stories, the letters of what was happening in my family's lives. I also did a ton of newspaper research. I looked through old newspaper archives for, in the old days, there was like nothing going on. They didn't have the internet. So the newspapers, so many newspapers, there were so many newspapers, like every little town had a newspaper. And, Rose Sinneken arrived by train today at 3:30. There were just like anything that happened, they were reporting on. So I could do searches of my family's name and learn so many things about what was going on and the dates associated with that. And I could then pair the dates. I would make these big timelines of, to cull all the research of what was I learning from a document versus a newspaper article versus, whatever it was, but I would put it by timeline date. And then I could match that with the date on the mortgage. And I would understand how the mortgage and the money relatively small amount of money they were taking out on this free land, was helping them. And what I started to see is it would help them to buy a new business that wasn't reliant on weather. It would help them to move. It would help them to buy more land. And I also found the General Land Office, which is a part of the Department of Interior, the BLM, under the Bureau of Land Management, has this incredible digital database where you can, you can search under a lot of different terms, but it's best if you know the county where a family was and their name. Anyway, you can look up their name and you can figure out all of the original homestead land that they received. So that was a very great jumping off point for me to start to understand who were the Jews of Jew Flats, when did they get their land. And I even got big empty plat maps from the Bureau of Land Management. They sent them to me from Montana. They're very nice during COVID. I think if it wasn't for COVID, I would have done the sort of micromanaging thing I've always done, which is to think I have to do everything. And I would have traveled there and I would have had these conversations. And in some ways, COVID really taught me the way I didn't have to do that as much, and that people would send me what I needed. I didn't have to sort of, I could just talk to them on the phone. And so people sent me these big plat maps, and then I mapped out where everyone's land was, which was a really helpful visual tool for me to see where people were. Another thing I did that I wouldn't have done except for the pandemic is I hired a woman who's really bright, she had a master's in history, and she actually during the pandemic would go into the deeds office for me and pull the records and then scan them. And then I did all the work of creating Excel spreadsheets and understanding what they were. But that was a huge shortcut and saved me countless hours and time away from my family of going into the deeds office that I, again, wouldn't have known that I could do or, should do if it wasn't for the constraint of really not being able to travel. So there were so many more, but I'm going to let you ask me a
Yeah,
question.
no,
Right?
no. It's so interesting how mortgages and loans, what they enabled your family, to be able to do
Yes.
and how they advantage them. Um, let's talk a little bit about how you reported on the Lakota side, of the story and how you told their story. And, what were the challenges, as a white woman covering this history? Can you talk a little bit about how you approached the Lakota version of the history of your family?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just making a note to myself of your questions. So the way I approached it, it was very critical that I had done that series that ran in the nation and Indian country today. I think I don't know that I could have written this book the way I did without that, because I had a body of work that potential sources could look to and read. And I the feedback I've gotten is that they could see that I was writing and trying to write these articles with a lot of nuance and context, and that meant a lot to the Native people that I wanted to interview. And so it opened doors for me. And also, like, for example, I knew that there were these mysterious so I don't know if we want to go look at it, but there's these
Oh,
mysterious
sure.
photographs. Even though I didn't grow up with any stories of my family and their Lakota neighbors, even though they lived so close, relatively close. We had no stories about that interaction. But there were these mysterious photographs of my ancestors posing with men dressed in regalia. And on
Wow.
my first several trips to Pine Ridge and Standing Rock and Cheyenne River reservations, tribal historians there helped me. If you go to this is my Uncle Louis, and this is Sylvan Lake in the Black Hills. And this photograph, tribal historians said, we think so the man on the left is my Uncle Jack Sinekin, and he's a really fascinating guy in his own right. And they said, we think this is Joseph Whitebull. And Joseph Whitebull was a famous guy. He was chief of the Minnekoju Lakota. He was Sitting Bull's nephew. There was a whole book written about him in the 30s. But because I had sources who trusted me, who were Native, one of them said, oh, I used to be married into the Whitebull family. I'll introduce you. And he connected me with the man whose name is Doug Whitebull, who the first day I met him on Standing Rock in Elder Housing, he said, I am the oldest living descendant of the man in that photograph. And so I ended up telling sort of the entangled histories of the Lakota and Jewish immigrants were really told in the specifics through my family and the Whitebull family because of
And
this
this
photograph.
is,
And that's Doug. And Doug is a former, now retired, really beloved in Lakota country professor, teacher, and coach who just had this deep interest in history. So he was very excited about my book. And because he was so respected in his community, he also was able to sort of help open doors for me of people, other elders and people to talk to. But interesting to me is that for example, thought that I would use I wanted to track how Doug's family's land records changed throughout time. And that I would have these sort of, here's how knowing my family records, I'm going to do the same thing with Doug's family records. And yet I couldn't, it was like I could find some of the original records. They're not called homesteads, they were called allotments that the Native people received from the federal government on their own land. But I couldn't actually, this is a story that I end up telling in the book. Doug and I worked literally for years, emails, phone calls. We visited the BIA office. We could never get them to share those records with us. So it also ended up being this very stark thing that I could send a stranger to get my family records, but Doug himself couldn't get access to his own family documents.
but
So
there's an amazing statistic about what happened to Lakota land in about 50 years. And maybe you can remind me, I
yeah,
should have the map of it. I probably have it somewhere, but how much of the Lakota land that existed, I think it was in 1850, ended up in Lakota hands still, by the early 20th century.
So this isn't precise, but because the treaties that set the land aside for the Lakota, reserved the land for Lakota usage in perpetuity, they weren't documented by metrics of any say. They would say it's from this mountain range to this river. So it's a little ishy, but I worked with a geographer at Haskell University, and we looked at the way, and at the beginning of my book, there's a map that shows how land is dispossessed, how the United States takes Lakota land more and more over time from this 1851 treaty to the present day. And you see, according to our research, as of 1908, when my family is planting their first crops on Jew Flats, the Lakota are living on just 2% of the land that they had reserved would belong to them in perpetuity. Yeah, less than 60 years earlier. So that was another way that I wanted to show the way land. There you go. There's the map.
This is the map, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
pretty startling when you see it over time, how much land disappears.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to remind people to start adding questions. Rebecca, I want to make sure I get in one important question, because it was one of my incentives for inviting you for the webinar, but that is like, at what point did you realize this was a book and not a long magazine article? Because I think, so much of investigative reporting, people gather so much material, and there's so much that they can't get into their even 10,000 word story for a magazine, or maybe 6,000, or multi-part series for a podcast. But at what point were you just like, oh, I've just got to write a book. I can't do this. And help others figure out, like, maybe they have a book as well.
Well, I think part of it was that for a very long time, I didn't want to write a book. I loved writing magazine stories. And by this point, I really wanted to write a book. So there was that. That was the first thing. But also, I had been writing this series of stories, and I really saw I wanted to write a really sweeping history. And that to do that, I needed space. And that in some ways, it was also because it was such a complicated idea that initially it kind of broke my brain to figure out how I would even structure this book, because it's like sort of three stories. It's the story of Lakota land dispossession and what the United States did to Native people, not just to take their land, but to try to take away their culture and religion as a way to divorce their relationship with land. It's the way my family benefited from that land, but also the threat of how they continued to face anti-Semitism in America. There's also this sort of threat of like debunking American myths. There's this threat of me not just telling these histories, but grappling with how we tell these histories. And so I ended up doing like all this research with my rabbi to understand what's the Jewish response to harm, even when you didn't directly commit, but something you benefited from. So that's a thread to the story. So it's really just this huge braided narrative that there was no, I mean, I guess I could have done it in a magazine story, but because you can do anything smaller if you have to, but it wouldn't have been as good. It couldn't have been done with as much care. And I also think, this is I think of this as a really American story. For most of us, if we look, we can find ourselves in the history of Native land dispossession. But most of us won't get a book deal from Viking to get to spend, and grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism to really have the time that it takes to do the work to see that story as clearly as I tried to see mine. So I also just needed more time, and I think a book deal allowed me to do that. It was enough. It was not enough money, but it was enough money to get started to try and do it. So yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend who's just finished an investigative book, and it's the same thing. It was just like, I just needed time. I just needed time.
Yeah.
Here's a question from one of our attendees. I will be getting your book, but I wanted to ask about your style of writing for this book compared to magazine stories or straight journalism. Any tips on getting into the groove for writing creative nonfiction so that a factual story is compelling?
I love that question. It's a great question. I loved having the ability. I think part of what I would always try and do as a magazine writer was just do what my editor wanted on some level. I mean, that was the key to my success. And getting it was intimidating to be like, what do I want to sound like? And
Mm,
and yet it was really exciting. And I would say tips for how to figure out what, so it's a lot voicier. That is the short answer. I tried, it's a pretty light touch in terms of my own personality showing up on the page. I really introduce myself at the very beginning and I show up at the end, but I'm kind of throughout the book, I dip in and I tried to be voicey, if that makes sense, just use some personality in the writing, which showed that I was still with you as the reader on the page, taking, sort of holding your hand through this very complicated story. And I would say that there were two things that really helped me, and I'm sure you've heard these before, but one, my very first boss, Betsy Marston, who used to be the editor of High Country News, she always used to say, rewriting is writing. And I mean, I rewrote this book a lot. There were certain chapters. Oh, chapter 4. I rewrote that chapter so many times. And so that was part of it. But also, I was only ever as good of a writer as the books I was reading. And so I just read so much fantastic creative nonfiction to get other people's styles. And I always feel like I'm trying to rip off Joan Didion, and I don't ever achieve it. But I think if I'm like just in the general region of her style, then I'm okay. So there's something about that.
yeah. I wonder how you approached essentially, reporting out, your family's past. I mean, you weren't the only one in your family who told these stories over and over again. And, was there a moment of discomfort? Was there resistance? How gently did you have to kind of show people what you were uncovering about their story of survival, but at whose expense? Talk a little bit about the personal relationships that were kind of at stake here.
I lost a lot of sleep. It was really stressful. I really was clear that I wanted to tell the truth, that truth telling was very important to me. And I worried that in order to do that, that I really did worry, would they still want me in their family? It was real, the stakes were so high for me. And I think but I worked so hard. It made me work so hard. And I would recommend Mary Karr's The Art of Biography is excellent. She has this sort of like 10 steps of like the things you should do if you're writing about your family. And I really followed those and it was excellent advice. I actually printed out that page and had it like on the wall in my office. But I tried to be transparent, first of all, about what I was doing, but I also didn't want anyone's opinions about what I was going to write or not. I mean, people had them, but I didn't let them influence me initially at all. And then when I did do some things differently than probably the way I was taught and trained. So, we're always told you never show anything until it's published. But in this case, I actually, and this was part of Mary Karr's advice, like I printed out the entire book when had been edited by myself many times, but it was nowhere near, going to press. And I brought a copy of the manuscript to my Aunt Etta in person. I also brought my very cute youngest child to sort of sweeten that. And I gave it to her. It was so nerve-wracking. We were at Shabbat dinner and everyone in the sitting around the table, and they're like, you should read the book aloud. And I found myself reading about my family to my family. I wouldn't recommend it, but it was fine. I mean, the thing is, yes, and I write this in the book. I describe this moment where my Aunt Etta says, don't write this part. I don't want you to write this. And then I write about why I end up writing about it anyway. And it was hard. And I guess what I would say is that I just kept showing up in the relationships. I kept leaning in. I kept listening to people. And listening to them didn't necessarily mean I rewrote a lot of it, actually, much at all. there are family secrets I didn't tell in this book, but the family secrets I did tell to me were very important to telling this larger narrative about both, the challenges that my family as immigrants and Jews experienced, but also the way they benefited. And I'm happy to share that at the end of the day, I really feel like my family is proud of me. It's called me right before Yom Kippur. She had an early full published copy of the book. And she wrote me an email actually. And she said, I just want you to know this was hard for me to read and I'm very proud of you and I love you. And she said, thank you for helping me be more of a realist at the age of 90, which was amazing. So
That's amazing.
yeah.
Bill Marimo, our board chair, has a great question, which is, did anyone in your family stay in Russia after 1908? And if so, what happened to them? If not, how difficult was it for them, to get out of Europe or to flee, maybe to the US as well?
I write about this a little in the first chapter of the book. So my great grandfather, Jake Cosberg, he brings during, kind of in the lead up to World War II, he brings like 14 members of his family over. But there's one brother who doesn't want to leave Russia because his oldest son has already been conscripted into the Russian army and is fighting. And everyone in that family was murdered by the Nazis, and they were lined up and shot in a pit in their shtetl. And that son, my great grandfather's nephew, actually survives the war. And they get this letter that I found that was written in Yiddish, that was written from a prisoner of war camp, but he ends up dying of, was it typhus? He gets sick and dies and doesn't get to come to America. So it's this heartbreaking story. But most of my family is part of that before the United States passes the 1924 immigration law, which is restricting immigrants from Eastern Europe. Most of my family leaves and comes to America, and joining the millions of other Jews who do this at the time, in the 19 teens and 20s. Yeah.
Right. We can both answer the next one, which is, did you do an audio version of the book? Yes, I listened to it. Rebecca reads it and she does a great job.
Yeah.
And then the second part of that is, did you record your interviews? And if so, are you considering possibly doing a podcast to reach a wider audience?
Oh boy, I did record a lot of my interviews. Although I should have recorded more of them, honestly. I didn't record a lot of like my phone interviews that I did. I would just type as I was talking to people. And in retrospect, it would have been wonderful to have all of those recordings. I have not done, I've recorded a lot of podcasts since the book came out and throughout my career, but I haven't ever done a podcast. I've been thinking about doing one, and it seems like a really exciting challenge, but also intimidating. And I keep having to remind myself, I don't know if this is a journalist thing, like there's this part of me that's like, okay, that's done, moving on, instead of reminding myself that I can keep finding new ways to consider this material. So it's a great question. I guess I'm not currently working on a podcast about the book. Let's say that. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm sure there'll be many people, myself included, to contact you about that.
Love that.
From Susan Ferris, a great question. Can you talk about how you decided to organize the book and the chapters? Is it chronological with an opening chapter? Does each chapter have a setting and a place? Did you think about how to weave the stories of the past with what facts you found out that might have challenged those? Just, did you go longitudinally, character? Talk a little bit about how you let the story unfold.
I love that question. I will say I didn't necessarily know at the very beginning how I would do this. And I think that there's something to be said about just getting into it and then you figure out how to solve the problems you've created for yourself. But what I ended up figuring out was the book, to me, it was very important that I didn't just want to write, not just a history, because history is so important, but I think, again, because I'm trained as a journalist primarily, not a historian at all, I was very curious in like, how does history play out today? And what's the connection between the past and the contemporary moment? So the book actually, within each chapter, is toggling back and forth between the events of the past and how it plays out now. And so on the one hand, the through line, the book opens with this kind of embarrassing scene. I'm the one who should be embarrassed, of my first trip reporting in a Native community that I took when I was a very young reporter in like 2001. So it opens, that's the prologue, and it's sort of his, honestly, I wrote it as a way to sort of hopefully let people not be defensive around this. Like I wrote this book as a book for the descendants of homesteaders, for mostly, for Americans to try and find themselves in this story. So I start with myself and how much I didn't know about my own story and my own history, hoping that for readers, that's a very cozy place if they don't know anything to start. And then it does move pretty chronologically through history. But again, within the chapter of the history I'm writing about, I'm going to bring it to this contemporary moment often to help the people like the elders, my Aunt Etta, Doug Whitebull, who are characters in the book, help us understand what that means to them today. And then each chapter, for the most part, flips between the Jewish story and then the next chapter is the Lakota story of the same general era. But there are chapters that I break that pattern, and they're much more entangled within the chapter of the Jewish and Native story. So I guess it's a mess, but you'll see when you read it.
It makes sense, and I think there's sometimes, I like to say, you take a little pit stop because you just have to explain a war and a conflict, and it's not even that it necessarily affected, directly your family, but it affects the whole environment in which people are operating in. So I thought it worked really well, and I will also say, I do hope people read this because in many ways you have created a model for all of us, and I don't just mean journalists, but there is a place for us in American history that we might not have thought about. And there is an opportunity for all of us to interrogate where we fit in, what that place is, the impact it's had on other people. And it's, if we were all, charged with doing that, I think it would really illuminate, how connected we are to the past, even though we might not think we are. A couple more questions. Can you talk more about applying for funding when you were researching and writing the book? Were there residencies or grants that you weren't successful at getting, that you advised people looking at it that you were successful at? What resources did you consult for writing a book proposal? Great questions.
Great questions. Okay, so I didn't know. Now, looking back, this feels like the biggest and best story of my career. But I mean, hopefully I'll write another book. But, at this moment, it feels like the best thing I could have ever done. But I didn't know that going into it. And I've always sort of had this approach, like, let's just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. So I wrote a proposal for a grant that was it was called the Regional Arts and Culture Council grant. It was just for writers and artists here in Portland, Oregon. And I think I got $7,000 or $10,000. Like, it wasn't this huge amount of money, but it was enough money. And I wrote the grant as like a 6-month amount of time. And there was a public facing component. So I did a lecture for free at the end of that period to just start my research. And that was huge because it gave me, first of all, it helped me have confidence that this was an idea that other people were interested in. And then it gave me enough money that I could take a reporting trip I went to Minnesota, I went to the Dakotas. I also used that time to start to write a book proposal. And then I wrote a proposal. And in terms of how I learned to write a proposal, I wouldn't say there was a book or something that I looked at, but I did look at all of my friends' book proposals. So knowing people who've written proposals, your agent, if you have one, or if you're looking for agents, which I did, I got a new agent for this project. And so I was also, at the same time I was doing this, I was writing like some of it to get an agent. And then those agents have sample proposals to look at. So I had to write 2 sample chapters, and I had to write sort of an idea of chapter summaries, which, by the way, I've learned subsequently, like, almost no one's chapter summaries is what ends up happening, but I think they want to know you've really thought it through. And then I got an advance from Viking, and I had a wonderful, wonderful editor there who helped me kind of think through ideas. But it wasn't, frankly, enough money for me, for the money I got. And so I was constantly applying for grants. And there are great websites like that, I can't think of them right now, but I'm sure even maybe FIJ would link to them, of like, here's all the different things you can apply for. And I tried to apply for a lot of them. So the hustle wasn't exactly over once I got the book, and there were plenty that I didn't get, but I did get a wonderful grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. I got the Whiting nonfiction, creative nonfiction grant, which was a huge chunk of money for me and a huge deal. And I will say something that when they called to tell me I got the award, I said, oh, I almost didn't apply. And Courtney Hodel, who was talking to me, she gasped and she said, let me get on my soapbox for a minute, because I had applied the year before and I hadn't won. And so I just was sort of like, I shouldn't reapply. That was so much work. And she said, you know, the people who win these things are not the people, they're not always the best journalists. They're the ones who keep applying. And it wouldn't even occur to me to apply, honestly, but my friend who's an academic said, you know, when we don't get a grant, we're encouraged to ask for feedback. And so because of that, I called the Whiting, and sorry to anyone from the Whiting if you're there for the new amount of calls you'll get, and I just asked, should I reapply? And they said, we can't tell you whether you can, what you should do, but it seems like from the notes from the judges, you were close. So that gave me the confidence to reapply. So
Nice.
yeah.
I'm gonna try and wrap a couple of different questions together, and particularly I want to get to one that just came in. One has to do with you talked a little bit about your editor, but what didn't get into the book that you were like still futzing over and you're still upset about? Is there what darling did you have to kill? But the other, so that's one question, and the second question, and then we'll wrap up when you answer this, is about whether or not you gave any of the book proceeds to any of the indigenous people who you worked with. What responsibilities, if any, do you feel, that to not just benefit from this story yourself, but others? And I would love for you to tell, because you took this story had a spiritual effect on you in some ways. I mean, it really sent you into study from a religious perspective about this notion of repair and giving back. And so maybe you can take the killing your darlings question and then end with how you personally have dealt with the responsibility of what you've learned about your family.
I love these questions. You guys must be reporters. They're so good. I don't feel at all sad about the darlings I had to kill, because it's all grist for the mill at some point. So I had before my editor actually read the book, a dear friend who's a poet read the book, and one of my closest investigative reporter colleagues read the book. And like, there was a lot of like cross out, like, this is too much hand wringing, like pull this out, or this scene is like not valuable. And my friend who's a poet just kept being like, you can write a poem about this. And I did, actually. I ended up writing some poems about some of the things that I didn't use. There were other things that I had to just take out because it was like a fascinating piece of history, but it wasn't close enough to that sort of place where the push and pull was happening. But I then ended up I could write essays about that stuff. I could use, that were used to promote the book. So I'm not at all sad about anything. There's enough here. It's fine. In some ways, actually, I have my experience of writing a book is that it's a relief. It feels like a relief to sort of see that you don't have to do it all. Not everything has to go in. The question of how I considered my responsibility to my native sources is a huge one that I thought about a lot. And I'm very grateful that I had mentors who helped me think it through. And I'll say there were several ways I did this. One, early on, before this was even a book, an indigenous elder who you meet in the pages of the book, who I met while working on a profile for her for the Nation. She said, if you're going to write this history, you need to grapple with it, and you should do that from your own culture. And so with that guidance, I spent several years studying with my rabbi Jewish models for repair. And I weave some of those models like ideas into the book. And based on them, there's one, Maimonides, who's this Jewish philosopher, said, there's these 6 steps to repentance. The first is stop doing the harm. The second is tell the truth out loud publicly. So you could argue the book is that. And 4 or third or something is like try and make some repair to the people who were harmed. So Doug Whitebull and some other Lakota elders, I was just in conversation over years with, what could I do? What could my family do? And it took a while. It took a while of knowing each other, I think, before there was a real relationship there, before I got an answer. But one thing Doug reminded me about was that there had been this ongoing effort that was native led to when private land comes up for sale in the Black Hills, to buy it and hold it in trust for all Lakota people. For the Lakota, for those of you who don't know, the Black Hills is like their spiritual home. It's for them the center of the universe. And the United States Supreme Court ruled that it was unfairly stolen by the United States from Lakota. So my family I created a family fund. I set the fundraising goal for $1.1 million, which is the amount in today's dollars that my family received in mortgages off our free land. And that fund it's not like of my own invention. It's a fund that's housed in the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which it's a native-led organization that's been helping Native nations get their land back for 30 years. So that was one piece, and it's been really amazing to see many people, not just family members, donating to that. And also, I realized, there's all this land acknowledgement that gets done. And I was thinking, this book is a land acknowledgement in many ways to the Lakota, but I wrote the book in my attic in Portland, Oregon. So in the back of the book, I kind of made a land acknowledgement, and my Native friends have taught me, like, don't make them empty. So I gave a relatively small, but some money, proceeds of the book, to a Native Nation-led organization here in Oregon that I really trust, and also an organization that's helping to bring the buffalo back to Lakota and other Native nations. And then finally, I thought a lot about, here I'm like taking a lot of time, a lot of Doug's time, and he is retired. And and no one in his family ever approached me about paying anything ever. But I followed the advice of some other journalists who've done this. And I basically, after the book was done, but before it actually came out, and this is not something I'd really ever talk about, but because you asked, and I think it's important as journalists that we think about this, and I don't know if it's right, but it's what felt right enough to me. I figured out how many hours I had spent interviewing Doug. And then I assigned I decided to pay him $100 an hour. And I paid him from my advance that amount of money. And so that's how I made peace with it.
Well,
So.
Rebecca, thank you so much. I'm going to try and rapidly wrap this up. You are amazing. Rebecca's put a long list of resources together, again, to help journalists find themselves in their communities and their communities in the history of America, particularly, taking on, native lands. Everyone who's registered, you're going to get an email from FIJ sometime next week with a link to the recording of the webinar and a tip sheet. Couple of reminders: the deadline for submitting proposals for regular grants, which is up to $10,000, is September 9th. The deadline for seed grants, these are grants for preliminary reporting. These are up to $2,500. The deadline is September 20th. If you have any questions about applying, or you want to make a suggestion for a webinar, you can email grants@fij.org. And if you go to the FIJ website under resources, there's a whole FAQ, there's a video that'll help you with the application process. Last but not least, our next webinar is going to be June 28th at noon Eastern time, and we're going to hear from a grantee named Jessica Miller, who at the Salt Lake Tribune is going to talk about an amazing investigation that talks about how she exposed how a Utah therapist built a reputation for helping gay members of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and how these men came forward to say that the therapist actually sexually abused them. So that'll be another fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great weekend. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, everyone. So fun to be here.